going? First, thanks for coming to the Colloquium here. We have Linda Jerofke. I want to remind everybody about our next one, since you're all here as a captive audience. February 12th, Mike Sell will be with us to talk about photography stuff, I'm sure. I forget what the exact topic is. But February 12th, plan on coming back. We'll have cookies and some coffee for you. Today, though, we have Linda Jerofke. Linda received her BA from Appalachian State in 1883. That was an honest accident, ladies and gentlemen. I will pay for that severely on down the line. Don't worry
1 year
about
after this photo was taken.
Yeah,
I
that's why
aged
she
well.
knows so much about this topic. No, 1983. She went on to receive a master's and PhD from the University of Oregon in 1995. She worked for the Burns Paiute for 7 years, 2001, and she came to EOU in 2003. Is that right?
No, I started in 2000.
2000 started here. So it's
I overlapped.
Since then, Linda's worked with Haven for Hunger, United Ways. She's a Rotary member. Last year, she was on a sabbatical where she studied early reservation life in Oregon, and that's what she's going to present to us today.
Okay.
Thanks.
Thank you. So I wanted to tell you a little bit of background of why I got interested in this. And it's one of the vagaries of going to graduate school is that at University of Oregon, most people think you go into graduate school and you know what you want to do. I knew anthropology, but not much beyond that at that point, and was figuring it out. And I was fortunate to be offered the opportunity to go to Alaska and visit a number of Athabascan villages, and later went back and worked with the village to document their subsistence lifestyle, which they could later use in the court systems and otherwise to prove their own subsistence rights. And this was actually in the mid-'80s. There was still a lot of competition with professional, non-native people that were hunting and fishing. And the hunter-gatherers up in the Arctic and subarctic were at great risk for losing some of their territory. And so I chose to do that. And then a few years later, I was talked into applying for a job with the Burns Paiute. My focus in life there was not necessarily archaeology at all. I was focusing on medical anthropology. And I had a friend who wrote a grant proposal with the Burns Paiute. I got hired. I got interviewed by the tribal council. And even though I had done archaeology and I could do it, they decided to pick me because I had experience working with tribes. And that was one of their primary goals, that they had somebody to do that. And at the same time, someone who was willing to find ways for tribal members to get trained in my field of study, anthropology. And it ended up, I was really fortunate to have really great folks working with me. I was the only non-native person in that cultural program. All the rest were tribal members. And then as I left, a tribal member filled in behind me as I left to come back to the university. But the story behind this was born when I was at the Burns Paiute. We were fortunate to get a grant proposal that allowed me to go up to Seattle, and I made copies of every single document that was up in Seattle for the Burns Paiute related to their former reservation that they lost. When it was said, and you'll hear more about it, that they no longer were on the reservation, so the Indians didn't need a reservation. Documents actually said that, and so they lost it. The backstory behind it is they were forcibly removed from their reservation area and held captive in Washington, which means they couldn't be on their own reservation at that time. But since then, I've been fortunate to work at EOU and worked with a number of Native students here 7 or 8 years ago, and with the Confederated Tribes of Umatilla Indian Reservation to get a Native American Studies minor here at EOU, and it has survived all the ups and downs of the economy at EOU, but has proven to be a success. And I teach a course specifically on the Native peoples of Oregon, and I found there are a couple of good books that came out recently, but indeed didn't fill in the backstory of what people were really experiencing. There are a lot of tribal stories that have been documented over time, But in looking at those historic documents, it gives you another level of insight in terms of people who were oppressing Native peoples at that time, as well as individuals that wrote letters to the reservations. So I headed off. I tried not to have any preconceptions of what was going to go on. My original goal was to spend time in Seattle, go down to Berkeley. They have historic documents related to the Native tribes of this region, and then to go to the Smithsonian, and then to the National Archives in DC. I found on my first visit that there was plenty of information in Seattle to focus years on. And so I concentrated on Seattle and Berkeley, and was fortunate to have actually one of my children who went along, who likes doing research, that helped, which was pretty fantastic. But in terms of the title, the assimilation, I use that word purposefully. The goal of that early reservation period was to assimilate all 500 plus tribes in the entire nation to follow in terms of European thought processes. And it's important to point that out. As I've been teaching over the years, often students will point out the Native American culture. And I point out over and over, there's not just one culture. They're very distinct, different languages, everything that goes along with it, and you have to consider that even in a place such as the state of Oregon. Vast differences. And I purposefully also put a picture of Chimawa. This was a photo taken at Forest Grove. Some of you know of it too now. It's in Salem, Oregon. It got moved. But it shows up in the historical documentation to great extent. Sometimes positive, sometimes negative. But it was evident at this time period it was to retrain children to think a different way. And people who are assimilating others do that. Now, you might think when you hear the word assimilation, if you're a Star Trek fan, you think of the Borg going out and assimilating. It really wasn't that much different, at least in terms of the nation that was taking over tribal lands. And the most effective way to do that is to target the children who don't have that much power at all, and or to target the parents who don't allow their children to go. So it's a very traumatic period in Oregon that was incredibly chaotic. And I knew some of this. I've had the fortune to talk to many tribal members and elders over the years about experiencing boarding schools and then the stories that their parents and grandparents handed down. And it was definitely traumatic. And it's actually a trauma that still continues today that you can't ignore at all. So I have up here at least a few things about the cultural changes that happen for tribes in Oregon. And I just put, many of these are still cultural, but there was significant cultural changes. Rules were made that they couldn't speak their own languages anymore. When they tried to speak their own languages, they were punished severely. I know just over the hill in Pendleton, there's stories of tribal members whose uncles or grandparents actually were abused significantly at times. They saw relatives that died from that punishment, and that's reflected throughout the state. So it's sort of, at least in anthropology and sociology, the program I'm in, we talk about those traumatic periods. We can't ignore that. It's something that we need to consider. And those kinds of punishments ultimately devalue the tribal cultures. And the most important part of this is that all of those cultures were as vibrant and rich and sophisticated as any European culture that had hit North America. It just wasn't recognized as so. You found the nation, as they pushed tribes west, And it really did affect Oregon tribes, because Plains tribes got pushed this way. It was a domino kind of effect that went on that didn't always go well. And what you found is, and I found it in the documents, throughout the tribes that were in Oregon, is that they took, at times, their culture underground. And it showed up in the Indian agent documents, the teachers' documents. There was a superintendent of Indians of Oregon and of the nation, and it showed up over and over. And the irony is that at times it was considered appropriate by the federal government to put a shining light on those cultures. And it usually happened when they would have visitors that would come to a reservation, and they would ask people to put traditional dress on and dance and sing and things like that. And then when it was done, they had to put it all away. So it was sort of a hide-and-seek game that went on. And you'll find as we go through this is that despite all of those actions that were going on, the tribes were surprisingly successful at retaining their cultural knowledge and passing it down. Information was lost, definitely. When I was in Burns, elders at that time that I was working with, we were working on a language program, they said they lost the old words. And they were really saddened by that fact. And they said they remember the discussions around it, but the stories around the words were just beyond grasp, which is a sad place to be. But they still retained some of the language and were pretty fluent in it. The other thing is that with food, this was documented a lot. The tribes at that time, before the advent of Europeans, lived off the land. It was a whole food that was a healthy food that was abundant, and it varied depending on the region, but it's clear that the tribes negotiated with each other, they traded, they would meet up at Celilo or other places and would trade their varying foods depending on that environment, which is carried forward today. What they didn't find is the same foods on the reservation necessarily. There were commodity foods that were brought in at varying amounts. Commodity foods in terms of processed flours and sugar and lard and those kinds of foods. Teas and coffee. Showed up often, beans, corn, things like that. By far, those were not local foods by any means. And what happened is that the reservations themselves were not big enough to sustain the people on it. And it was evident in the reservation documents. There was considerable across the entire state of Oregon. There was continual documentation about a lack of food on the reservation, that people were suffering. Elders, and they used the word indigent, they just did not have enough food. At times on some of the reservations, you would find Indian agents who were essentially considered by Washington, D.C. as the caretakers of the tribal members on those reservations. You would have on occasion people who would fight against it and saying, this is not going well, people are suffering. Other times, there was no caring that showed up in those documents at all. None at all. And so it was a very difficult time. At the same time, those kinds of foods that I just described that show up in those documents are very addictive. People got used to them. I mean, sugar and flour and lard and things like that, they got used to, but at the same time, what started entering in was a relationship with alcohol that was heavily documented in the literature. And it was documented by tribal members coming in, expressing concerns about people off the reservation coming on the reservation trying to sell alcohol, and then abuse of it. And you could see some disintegration of cultural belief systems when it was documented that one spouse or one family member would abuse another. And it was clear in the oral histories I've heard over time that that was not considered acceptable. But people made poor choices under the use of the drugs. And it was an ongoing problem on all the reservations. And a fight against the people that kept trying to enter on and start businesses like that. And it happened throughout the entire state. The borders were not heavily patrolled at all. We see lines on maps, but what happens is there might have been only 6 or 7 employees on that reservation that were working. They couldn't monitor all the borders, and so you would have people encroaching on reservation lands, trying to take land from a settler's point of view, and then you'd have people that would show up starting a business just on the reservation without any questioning by anybody. And that was all documented in the literature. The other thing is, at least in terms of housing, there's the vast majority of the native peoples here moved from food source to food source. That in itself allowed for a healthy environment. You leave your waste behind, it disintegrates and goes back in the earth, and then by the time you come back, it's a very safe place to be. There started to be problems with disease related to the housing. It's evident the housing was poor in quality, poorly ventilated, not well heated, and to be honest, now that we know, had lead paint and put people in danger. So the housing was problematic. The other thing too is just technology in general. One of the goals of putting people on reservations was to retrain them. And one of the primary ways was to set up a mill. And of Oregon, every single tribe had access to forest lands. And so it was a natural progression. The thing is that that kind of technology, with people that had not used that type of technology before, it was very dangerous. And I could see in the records, it kept showing up that injuries would happen. They were dangerous because the oils and those mills would catch on fire because people would be trying to stay warm while they're doing their milling. Became problematic too. And then as we think generally about control, you've already heard a lot about the control. Native peoples had the control taken away from them, especially in the early years. Other people were making decisions about their lives. But starting from the mid-1800s, as we got closer to 1900s, you found more pushback in the literature. It was documenting that tribes were coming forward and saying, as elders and spokespeople for their members, that we want more control over their lands. And there was an interesting transition that happened, but it varied depending on the tribe. And I think a lot of it had to do with culture. Ironically so, 2 of the tribes that were more proactive, at least as documented in the literature, was the Umatilla Indian Reservation and the Warm Springs. Part of that, I think, had to do with the size of their population and pre-contact and negotiating and working with people, is that it was evident that they were more proactive and had Indian agents that listened to them, at least on writing. It could have varied in reality. Other tribes had less choice. People down on the Malheur Reservation were thought of the lowest class of Indians in the state. You saw that in the documentation about the Malheur Reservation, and I saw it documented on other reservation documentation. They would talk about the Paiute and how they're less than. And it was an interesting thing to think of because they have an incredibly rich culture that I got to experience for a number of years. But there was differing interactions that happened. And then the settlers. For the settlers, as we all know in Oregon, we had well over 300,000 people that came along the Oregon Trail. They wanted land. There was a belief system, especially early on, that tribal members were not fully human at times. And so that's why the retraining was happening. And people wanted land. And there were conflicts over time that were well documented. Part of it were conflicts where Indian agent personnel would sell off the commodities that came on the reservation. I usually found about that in the literature because you would have an Oregon superintendent of Indians chastising and firing somebody on the reservation when they found out about that at times. Other times, settlers were allowed to settle directly on the reservation without any intervention. And that too is documented. It's surprising what you find out that people documented in the writings about the reservations. And then finally, the Army. There were Army forts all over Oregon. And I would encourage you to Google it and look. You would be surprised how many Army forts. The vast majority started out near reservations. The idea was documented as protecting Indians from settlers, and then later switched in the literature saying we're protecting the settlers from the Indians. And the unfortunate thing is that the interaction between tribal members and Army personnel were usually less than positive. For young women on the reservations, they were put at risk. I was somewhat horrified by this, is that one of the most dangerous reservations to be on in Oregon at that time was at the coast. The coastal reservation, which you'll see in a minute here, is documented as, it was called the Coastal Indian Reservation. It now includes the Grand Ronde and Siletz, Coquel, Coos, Umpqua, Siuslaw. What happened is, one reason is that there were native-on-native attacks and fights. Traditionally, the folks all along the coast didn't get along at all. There were some warring societies. And what happened on the coastal reservation is that the federal government took people from Washington all the way down to California, from the Willamette Valley to the coast, and stuffed them on one big long reservation. And so you saw the native-on-native violence, and on top of that, Army violence. At least in the documentation, there were far more murders and deaths and rapes at the coastal reservation. My theory, and I was fortunate during my stay going up to Seattle, I was fortunate, I have a brother that lives in Redmond, and so I drive back and forth. And in the evenings I come back and he goes, well, what did you learn today? And I remember very vividly after reading about, starting on the section about the coastal reservation, going, this was a horrible place. There was violence, confusion, lack of control, and it just purely wasn't safe. And more than any of the other ones, you found people trying their best to escape it. Ironically, after reading that, is that I had a former student who died not too that long ago. But when I was reading about those trying to escape, it was a student that came here who was a tribal member, and he actually ended up trying to be taken to a boarding school. He was an elder, and he had told me a story one time. I mean, he was born far after this period, but he was telling me a story as how he escaped by passing to look like a Mexican. He went to live somewhere else so he wouldn't be put in a boarding school. And so when I was reading about that, that kept flashing in my mind. But what you find here is that I was talking about the Malheur Indian Reservation. It's the one that's in Harney, a little bit of Grant County and Malheur County. That's where not just the Burns Paiute, but at least in terms of the executive order that created the Malheur Reservation, it was for the wandering bands of northern Paiute, which to be honest, in itself was slightly problematic, is that those wandering bands didn't really have a chief. Although in the literature they're referred to as chiefs, they were extended family bands that were put in that one location in an incredibly beautiful spot. So if you've ever gone that way, it's the Malheur Forest is really where their reservation was. And if you go to Ventura and go down to Beulah Reservoir, that's where the Indian Agency still is under the water. They flooded over those buildings of the Indian Agency. The next one, the Kalamath Indian Reservation, which I was talking to somebody earlier today, in the documentation, widespread corruption by people that were working on the Kalamath Reservation. There was deals, sweet deals going on with people in and around the reservation, selling off reservation property, allowing people to come on and set up their businesses. All sorts of things were going on that happened over and over, and they had an incredibly high overturn of the people. On the Umatilla Indian Reservation, what is most interesting is that some of that documentation you had at that reservation is that individuals that were incredibly interested in tribal culture and documented it. And the same is for the Warm Springs. There were, at times, not always, Indian agents that interviewed tribal members, documented their belief systems, their foods, and things like that. So there was some interest in what tribal life was like. And then about Warm Springs too, and you'll see a picture, is they indeed, in the literature, were considered an incredibly important economic force in the Willamette Valley. They were sought after by the settlers that settled farms in the Willamette Valley as workers on the farms. And there was hundreds of pages talking about recruiting them to come. And businesses writing, the Indian agents saying, who can we hire to come and work on the farms? So it was interesting, the kind of literature that was put in there. And then also in the coastal reservation, what showed up the most compared to any of the others was discussions about Chimawa, the boarding school in Forest Grove and later in Salem. And it was mixed information. Some of it were documentations, just notes saying, a parent saying, I want to send my child there. And then other notes that came back and said, with the Indian agent reporting to a parent that your child is lonely and wants to come home. And then even more contrary, an Indian agent saying, this family won't send their kids and we're going to send tribal police to go and take the kids and force them there. So it was very chaotic in terms of those choices. The irony behind some of that is that, at least for the coastal reservation, there were actually a few students that were sponsored by the Indian Agency to go on to Oregon State University to get college degrees, and some of who came back as teachers. And that was well documented too, of that kind of interaction. But this gives you an idea, at least, of where people were moving around. Now, I have up here rules, rules, and more rules. You would not believe how many rules came out. There could probably be 100 books full of pages of rules about what you can or can't do on a reservation. And I just put up a couple of the commissioners of Indian Affairs. And what happened is rules covered everything. There were rules about books. What books can be bought to put on the reservation, how we have to teach them, and in fact, how you arrange the classroom in terms of the best learning. And to tell you the truth, I sort of wish my mom was around because she was born in 1915, and it would have been nice to talk to her about what she experienced about that same time, at the turn of the century, and the books, like McDuffie readers and things like that. And, but there were huge lists of hundreds of books that you could choose to teach and use in the classroom. and it was apparent that they were ordered on a regular basis. So there were resources provided. Along with classroom kinds of things is that there was documentation across all the reservations about buying clothes for children. They didn't sound like very comfortable clothes. They were wool. They were probably been scratchy, not anything like a traditional dress that they would have used originally, or even cotton or muslin that they could have bought at a store and made a dress or other clothing out of. Holidays were celebrated across all the reservations. Every year, December 25th came around, there were notes about buying 30 pounds of nuts and 30 pounds of candy, and letters from community members saying, I want to provide gifts to the children so they can have Christmas. It was an interesting kind of contrast. And in fact, at some of the reservations, the teachers were using their pay to buy items. And so holidays were important. They had 4th of July. Those were all documented in detail, and was an interesting contrast to the control that I got to read about. Now, I'll come back to the schools. Religion. Traditional Native religions were not tolerated on the reservations. It was pretty evident. And it was reported when somebody did so that they would be punished. And the irony is that lasted only a little while before, across almost all the reservations, except the Malheur, which was lost fairly quickly, is that across all the reservations, tribal members started pushing back. Or when Quakers would come on the reservation, they would merge tribal belief system songs and things like that into the Quaker activities, or the Protestant. It was an interesting dichotomy. In Burns, and you'll see a picture in a minute, there was a Catholic priest who decided to fight for the Burns Paiute after they lost their reservation, Father Hoyle, and used his funds and fought in court on their behalf. Others wanted to control the kinds of religious gatherings that was foreseen as being dangerous. During the 1800s, things that people were considering were worries about the ghost dance, the use of peyote, and thinking it was a dangerous act to go through. And those were some of the reasons why there were controls over tribal religions, as well as healing. It was interesting to me, especially on the Malheur Reservation, discussions about healers, because there were a number of traditional healers on the Malheur Reservation, and they did not necessarily get along with other bands on the Malheur Reservation. And you had what was documented as chiefs' families avoiding each other because they didn't know what curse was going to be put on their family, and would hide in different parts of the reservation. And there was documentation from Indian agents going, we need to find so-and-so chief to see if they're okay. And then another person from the Indian agency coming back and saying, well, their family does not want to come back to the headquarters. They're afraid of this other family. It was sort of fun things, that, at least in terms of personal dynamics that were going on the reservations. Travel was regulated. Early years, you needed the approval of the Indian agent to leave the reservation, a piece of paper to travel with. Now, do you think everybody followed that rule? Any guess? No, lots of people didn't follow the rule. And so, I mean, remember, it's a big reservation. You don't have guards along the reservation, and people would leave, primarily because their traditional hunting, fishing area might not have even been on the reservation, and they wanted to go there. And so they went. And then we come back, and you would have documentation, well, we told them they shouldn't do that anymore. Sometimes they were locked up in jail, It didn't last long, and it was like a parent to the child relationship documented in those letters. But people did not stay confined to the reservations. Marriage and sexuality was of oddly weird importance to the Indian agents. There were about young people having sex. They needed to control it. Sex could only happen in marriage. The idea that a man might have multiple wives, which in fact during the reservation period some of the tribes practiced polygamy. And for the Indian agents who came from a Catholic or Protestant background, it was really problematic to them that that was going on, and they wanted to stop it. And lots of literature about controlling that. And then allotments in the land. I'll bring up a comment. I'm teaching Native Peoples of Oregon online right now, and there was a comment the last couple of weeks about how is there so little tribal land left? And a lot of it had to do with allotments and the loss of lands, which some of it had to do with conflicts that were going on and land was lost. Others had to do with the Dawes Act that happened that essentially divested tribal members of their land. But what I wanted to go first is talk about some of the conflicts before I get to the Dawes Act, is lots of conflicts happened in Oregon. Lots. Tribal members reported it. They were documented as worried about some of the conflicts. And there are many more than just these three individuals. Chief Winnemucca, in the literature for the Malheur Reservation, that was one of the chiefs that was worried about one of the other chiefs, and then headed down south towards Winnemucca, Nevada, and set up his extended family there. You may have heard about his daughter, Sarah Winnemucca, who, depending on who you talk to, at least in terms of Northern Paiute, she was really good or really bad. But what the Winnemucca family is associated with is the Bannock War, which was not one big war, it was multiple battles all over the place that involved Umatilla, Cayuse, Wasco, Paiute, Warm Springs, Shoshone, and Bannock. The story is that over in Idaho, some settlers plopped down, put a bunch of cows in a camas field, and tribal members had gone enough of that kind of behavior, and a bunch of young guys from over in Idaho crossed the river, headed to the Malheur Reservation, and wanted to go to war. They'd had enough. And that's a story I've heard from tribal members. It's sort of a quick and dirty kind of version, is that what was in the Indian agent documents was the debates that went on. At least what was documented said the elders were worried about that. They didn't know if they wanted to go into the war. They didn't like the idea of Bannock and Shoshone getting involved in it, and told the young men no. Well, they didn't listen. We know we had the Bannock War, and the Bannock War affected a good portion of eastern Oregon and on into Idaho, a little bit actually up into Washington. And what happened is that some of the Paiute headed down south, some headed to other reservations and stayed there and hid out, and others were rounded up at Fort Harney in the Harney Valley of Harney County, and in the winter marched north to the Yakima Indian Reservation and held there. Many people were lost along the way, and before long, people didn't stay there. They started escaping. They would swim across the river, holding on to their horses to survive, and the Columbia River did not look like what it looks like now. It was a wild river. It was a free river. It's not free now with all the dams. it was incredibly dangerous. So if you think Columbia is dangerous now, it doesn't even compare to what we've looked at in that time period. And started heading back home towards the Malheur Reservation. Around that same time, Chief Joseph is well documented, trying to escape the reservation and the choices that were being put on him, heading north. The irony, and this is a story I didn't know, is that there were tribal members on the Malheur Reservation that were scared about the Nez Perce coming there. They were scared that something bad might happen. And I hadn't ever heard that story before, but it was documented in the literature. And then Captain Jack's stronghold with the Modoc down in Klamath country held off far more Army personnel than you would ever think a small number of tribal members could do. Killed one of the most powerful at that time Army personnel. Surrendered under a white flag with the idea that they wouldn't be punished, and then a series of men were later killed. So the white flag wasn't honored. But it was a traumatic time period. And at the same time, there were Rogue River wars going on. So education, I like this because it's actually from Chimawa. It has the training of young ladies to learn to sew and cook and do those activities, of young men how to make boots, to work as a millwright, to retrain them. And so at any of the boarding schools, half the day would be in a class learning about your reading, writing, and arithmetic. Supposedly half the day was learning a trade, whether you liked it or not. And so here's a couple pictures of the boarding schools. This one is at Warm Springs, and some of these buildings are still on reservations. Here's at Chimawa, where a lot of kids came. And I did learn when I was in the 80s in Alaska that the elders then actually tended Chimawa from Alaska. They were sent down to Chimawa as a boarding school. Here's more pictures. Bands were important on the reservations. It was taught quite a bit. There was extensive documentation about trying to find teachers who could teach music and do singing, as well as athletics. So that's 1909 and 1910, I think, there. The other thing is gender roles. It varied among the tribes in Oregon, and what we do know is that there were patrilineal practices among many of the tribes in Oregon, where men had more power or choice than women. But there were some matrilineal where women had more power, and that was not even allowed. And for the Malheur Reservation is one of those, actually, is that there was a matrilineal practice, and in fact, it held true that when I was there, starting over 20 years ago, is that there was a practice on tribal council, there was far more women than men. And what happened is there was a gradual changing of the roles because of all the indigenous populations in Oregon. Despite having a patrilineal, matrilineal, the activities of males and females were well valued. They weren't necessarily so under this new system at all. I talked about religion already. I got ahead of myself, but here's Father Hoyle. What we do know is that he was punished by the Catholic Church for standing up for the tribe. There was documentation that he was fighting for them to get tents and housing and a reservation, because at this time they were not considered recognized by the federal government at all. They had lost their reservation. They didn't get it back until 2/3 of the way or 3/4 of the way through the 20th century. But he helped them with that. There was documentation of the court proceedings against Father Hoyle that shows up in some of the documentation, and in fact was essentially run out of town. because he was helping tribal members. I've talked a little bit about the land use. The idea was the living under hunting, gathering, and fishing was not the way to go, and they were going to focus on timber and farming and ranching and reprogramming it. What happened, though, is every reservation documented takings, whether it was from a railroad going in and negotiating with the federal government and not talking to tribal members, entering in and taking land. There were roads going through. There was documentation when Indian agents would describe how they were riding through the reservation and found a telephone company putting up telephone lines through the reservation just because they thought they could do it. It happened over and over and over for land use and interfered with it. What I like about this one, though, is that for the hop pickers, there were opportunities for tribal members to learn some kind of business activity. And it was apparent on some of the reservations that people were proving to be successful as business owners. Most definitely. I mentioned the Dawes Act, and I found this picture online. It describes when it was decided by the federal government to allow tribal members to be farmers and ranchers. And the idea was that what was happening on the reservations weren't necessarily working in terms of retraining. You remember, they kept doing what they had learned for many, thousands of centuries, is that what happened is that the federal government decided that they could divest themselves of the responsibility of the reservations, and they put up land under the Dawes Act. Depending on where you were, it could be 80 acres, it could be 160, were allotted to the heads of the household. And what happened is that that land was the reservation land. And what we have today is the impact of it. For all the tribes in Oregon, if you look at their reservation land, it looks like a checkerboard, because some of the land's been bought back, some of it was retained when all the reservation wasn't lost, and or they're individually owned allotments, which for modern times, it's incredibly problematic for maintaining land use and otherwise. But what was documented, as soon as this came aware, the general public was sending hundreds of letters to every Indian agent saying, let me know which land is up, I want to buy it, how can I get a good deal, and I want that land. And when will the native person get off of it? Over and over and over again. And it was an assembly line of divesting federal responsibility over Indian lands. The violence during that period escalated. It's evident in what was documented. Tribal members were confused. They didn't understand individual land use. When it went to the Dawes Act, they fell under state tax laws. And they didn't know you had to pay taxes necessarily. And many individuals lost it. And or despite federal rules where it was supposed to be a 25-year protectorate period, the Indian agents more often than not ignored it and allowed tribal members to lose their lands. And it was incredibly well documented in the Indian agent documents. So, a story of my somewhat sad tale is that there's been success. If you remember the original maps, and the sizes don't necessarily correlate, but the Burns Paiute has, they've had a chance to buy a few ranches, has 11,000 allotment acres owned by individual tribal members, 2,000 to 4,000 depending on what ranch you're talking about, of reservation land. You have, for the Umatilla Indian Reservation, is now the Confederate Tribes, the Umatilla Indian Reservation. You have the Kalamath tribes that have 3 tribes. that are still on it, although they're tribal members from all those original ones that are still in and around that area that were transplanted. Remember the coastal reservation that was big and long? They ended up with individual reservations. And then you have the Warm Springs that still has close to the same general size. And what's happened is that despite all those changes that happen, the cultures are vibrant. Some tribes are hanging on to their languages, their traditional languages, better than others, but every single one is actually teaching it on their reservations with great success to the younger generations. And in fact, we're trying our best we have, in cooperation with EOU, is that we're working with a Grand Ron teacher to teach Chimawa. We're hoping to get other tribal languages as college classes. And the other thing is that they are an important economic base in the state of Oregon, besides an important cultural base that provides incredible diversity. And the irony of this is that, like some of you, most of my childhood, I grew up in Oregon. I was born in Oregon. I was talking to Shoni here about a family friend was a Kalamath tribal member. And the thing is I grew up in Oregon in the 60s and 70s as a kid, is that very little of that history was taught in K through 12. And unfortunately, not that much is still taught, at least judging by my children's experience. It's an important, diverse opportunity to interact, and every single tribe has incredibly important cultures that can share and enrich our entire communities. So I wanted to thank a few people, sabbatical and summer stipend. Thank God I got it. I really needed it. And I have a dear friend who, if he listens to us online, Greg Monahan, told me for years it's the best thing that we can do is go and get refreshed. For me, despite my sad tale I told you, it was wonderful exploring those documents. It was also wonderful is that I saw tribes from all over the Northwest at Seattle at the archives going through it. And it was really fun talking with them and learning from them. At the National Archives, the archivist that I work with was Patty. For anybody who ever wants to, go up there. They're wonderful people, willing to help you at any way and cost. And then at University of California, Berkeley, who had way more rules, by the way, than the National Archives about you documenting. I was surprised, but they helped along. The ANSOS program my dear colleague Rory, who right after, he's looking freaked out, right after he started really in our program, I took off and left him on his own on the anthropology side, and I think he did fine, and he had Aaron around, but I really appreciate the ability to do that. And then I put James and Judy Reed. It's my brother. I had a very nice brother who allowed me to stay in Seattle for free and took care of me. So it's always good to have big brothers who allowed me, otherwise it would have been hard to afford the sabbatical. And finally, my family, we have 2 teenagers. My husband was on his own with teenagers more often than not and survived. And then at the same time, my children got to participate in the research. And in fact, the National Archives were redoing their Native American page. And it was sort of fun, is for my daughter, they asked for her opinion as a kid to get around it. What did you think about the pages and things like that? And it was really fun for her to participate and see that. So anyway, I thank you. I really appreciate you coming out. And I'm ready for questions. Go for it, Les.
Linda, I was interested in both the kind of managerial control and control of land use and that difference between the reservations that were set up treaty-wise versus executive order.
Yeah, for the Malheur Reservation, they fared quite badly. It was executive order. They didn't get as many resources. it was evident in what was documented, whether it's from DC or in Oregon, that they had a lesser status.
Does that still hold today?
Yes, in my opinion, it still goes on. I mean, they're part of the 9 federally recognized tribes, but at least in terms, I don't think it's necessarily in terms of tribal interactions with each other. I think that having worked for that tribe and sat across from federal agency and state people, is their knowledge of tribes is limited at best. And so they'll mimic that information back sometimes without understanding the complexity of it. But what I have seen is at times the treaty tribes have a slightly higher status than the non-treaty, definitely. And at least in the documentation, even going back to the mid-1800s, more resources were being poured into those. So, yeah. Have it, other questions?
What are you doing with this information in the sabbatical? Did you publish? Did you?
Not yet. I'm trying. I have, it's a good question. I have multiple things I'm doing. Is that when I came back, I did the crazy thing is that I agreed to be associate dean for 2 years. And so, yeah, he knows, and he warned me not to do it. But is that associate dean half-time, teaching half-time, and I never realized the impact of all of that. But I have been talking to a publisher. I want to document that, to compare and contrast the tribal experiences. I have over 75,000 pages of documents that I took digital photos of. And my plan is, if by the end of this next summer, is that I have them all by Indian agency. My plan is to crop them and make them look nice and put them on CDs and give them to each tribe too, to hand over it. I know that long time ago, Coquel went, and then Siletz went over to DC and made copies of documents. But I figured since I have so many, I'm willing to share it. And so I was hoping to give them to cultural and education programs to have. And then hopefully my ultimate goal would be, besides just documenting this literature, is to figure out ways to work with tribal members to do some co-authoring of articles down the line to intersperse the what was documented in terms of the Indian agent's perspective along with tribal stories. It would be nice to see that compare and contrast. It's my long-term goal. But I want to publish it because I think it's an important part of history, but it's not just mine, so I'm willing to share it. That's my goal. So, questions? Did I depress everybody? The thing is, it was a good story in the end.
Could you say a little more about the language programs?
Oh, the language programs, it varies depending where you are. And part of that has to do with money and the funding, although some of the tribes are doing it without any money. When I can start with my first frame of reference at Burns Paiute, they have a hardcore elders group, hardcore, and they decided to do a language program, and it turned out that both Umatilla and Warm Springs had already started. And I went and visited both to see their programs. I got to see some of the classes in Pendleton. This was like 20 years ago. And at Warm Springs, they were doing some of the first computerized programs for teaching. And so I came back, and for the Burns Paiute, I was fortunate to get, way back then, a linguist from University of Oregon who ended up doing his dissertation on Burns Paiute and that dialect. And what has happened over the years is there's been grant funding to continue language programs. And when I was there, all tribal employees were supposed to take a weekly class in Paiute, and I'm bad at it. But I took that, and every single program had to do it. So for the health center, they had to learn words around medicine and things like that. For me, it was all the cultural plants, which I'm fine with. I know those, the cultural plants and things like that. And so that was a really good program, and they've still continued it. In Pendleton, they have Umatilla and Nez Perce, which are strongly taught, and I'm hoping very much that we can get Umatilla taught as an EOU class. But they have a really rich language program going on. That's also taught at Nikiawe. For Warren Springs, they've been teaching it in their grade schools for a long time, and they also have adult learner classes. For Klamath, they really push to have some of the Klamath language in the public schools. And 15 or so years ago, the tribes came together in the Oregon legislature, which proved that tribes could certify their own language speakers and could take it into public schools. So they have the right to do that, which was phenomenal. On the coast, almost all those coastal languages were lost. I mean, there was so much disruption even early on. Before the East to West movement, you had individuals from the Hudson Bay Company and Russia doing huge impacts on the northwest coast area. But they are learning Shinnequawa and teaching that. And in fact, they teach it at Lane Community College. They've taught it at Portland State, and they have classes on the Grand Run Reservation. So I think they're doing well. At least the demonstrations I've seen young kids being involved in it. The ultimate way is you need people speaking it in their home for it to be really living. And yeah, and so I've seen some middle-aged folks that I would be classified as embarrassed that they know the language, they can understand it, but they're embarrassed saying it. But they can move past that and start speaking it at home. Yeah, because if you don't have language, you lose a lot of culture. You lose a lot. So, other question? Okay.
In your research,
Mm-hmm.
in 1934, Howard Wheeler Act,
Mm-hmm.
all the Northwest tribes ended up in Chimawa,
Yeah.
and I've never seen the transcript of what happened. Did you? We know what our chiefs came back with.
Right.
1934 to 1949. They were still under the chief system, but I asked for a research card to go to Seattle like you
Mm-hmm.
and look through the documents to find out what exactly transpired in Chimawa with all of the Northwest tribes on whether to accept the Howard Wheeler Act or not.
Right.
Did you come upon that document?
No, I didn't. And I looked through that purposefully. What I found out is that at Chimawa, those documents weren't well kept, and they actually got wet and moldy for some of those. And I actually wasn't allowed access because they were dangerous. And they're trying to process it, but I didn't see any, unfortunately. But I focused more on 1850 about to 1925, but I didn't see any. But I'm willing to write Patty and see what she has. And I can let you know. But yeah, I didn't come across any.
Well, as a footnote to that, as a young chairman,
Uh-huh.
I asked the elders when I became tribal chair at Umatilla,
Yeah.
what happened in Chimawa, because the two elders I asked were interpreters for the chiefs.
Uh-huh.
This was in 1934.
Right.
They were young men, and they told me the same thing, that they refused to accept that act because it was another promise that was not going to be kept.
Right.
And so if you took the corporate way that was being presented,
Right.
the chiefs felt that it was another promise they were not going to keep, and that they would lose more land in order to pay for the programs being offered.
Right.
So they didn't do anything until 1947.
Right.
And the committee was formed to create the Constitution and bylaws, which was adopted in 49,
Right.
but it only passed by 13 votes, too.
That's pretty tight. Yeah. I appreciate that. Yeah, but I'll send Patty a note and see what I can find. But yeah.
Appreciate it.
Yeah, I wouldn't mind. But Any other questions? Well, I really appreciate it. You probably didn't know it was going to be a sad story. That could have been a hint. But I think it turned out to be a good story in the end. So thank you. Okay. Uh-huh.
Hey, I'm Sean Brooks. I was wondering if possibly I could maybe get some of this PowerPoint sent to me.